Happy New Year, and thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Foreword, the podcast series brought to you by ISS ESG, the responsible investment arm of Institutional Shareholder Services. I'm Mara Souders, your host and communications lead for ISS ESG. Today I'm joined by my colleagues Lydia Sandner and Thomas Harding. Lydia serves as Associate Vice President, ESG Ratings and Regulatory Affairs, and Thomas is the Associate Vice President and ESG Product Manager, Regulatory Solutions Lead. Stay tuned as Lydia and Thomas dive into the regulatory requirements of the EU Taxonomy and as they explore what investors and corporates can do to ensure their compliance. Thanks so much for joining me today, Lydia and Thomas.
Thanks very much for having us, Maura. It's a pleasure to be here speaking today about this very important and interesting subject. As we all know, there has been an enormous amount of interest and discussion around the EU taxonomy. Can you tell us what it is and why it is getting so much attention?
Sure, Tom. Thanks for the question. The taxonomy, first and foremost, is a classification system defining economic activities as green. It is the first such classification at the regulatory level. The taxonomy regulation applies to investments and it defines what is a green investment. Depending on the uses of the taxonomy, this can have an impact on the investment in or the financing of certain economic activities. In terms of criteria, to be green, an economic activity needs to contribute to one of 6 environmental objectives, which are climate change mitigation, adaptation to climate change, sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources, transition to a circular economy, waste prevention and recycling, pollution prevention and control, and protection of healthy ecosystems. Activities should also not significantly harm any of these objectives, and there are criteria set for determining such harm. And they also have to respect minimum social safeguards, which means respecting international human rights, such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD Guidelines on Multinational Enterprises.
Excellent. Thanks for that detailed introduction. Accounting for the current state of regulatory requirements, how can corporates and investors apply the taxonomy and comply with the requirements?
Yes, so the regulatory requirement is about disclosure. Investors offering investment products in the EU have to either disclose the percentage of taxonomy-aligned green investments in their products or include a standard disclaimer stating that the product does not take into account the EU criteria for environmentally sustainable investments. Since currently such data is not generally reported, corporates falling under the EU reporting obligations will have to disclose the percentage of their taxonomy-aligned revenue. Now, despite this, availability, gathering of data, and respective assessment will remain an issue, especially also with regard to investee companies outside the EU. In addition to disclosure, the taxonomy can also be used for other purposes. For example, to green your portfolio by choosing taxonomy-aligned green investments, or to engage with investee companies, encouraging them to become greener. The taxonomy will also form the basis of the EU Green Bond Standard and the EU Eco-Label. Now, Tom, we've talked about the regulatory requirements, but what should market participants consider going forward? What should investors address internally?
Thanks, Lydia. Good question. EU taxonomy compliance is very much still a moving target. The requirements and the criteria are evolving, and there is a staggered implementation of regulatory obligations over the next 24 months or so. Initially, at least, there are no absolute performance requirements or thresholds that must be met. However, the increased level of transparency and disclosure will result in much higher levels of scrutiny. Prior to this new regulation, it was possible for market participants to greenwash their own products and portfolios, marketing and advertising them as favourable and high scoring from an ESG or climate perspective, when in reality, in fact, they were not. This is no longer an option. Questions that investors should be asking themselves include the following. To what extent do our financing or investment objectives mitigate climate change and/or promote adaptation to it? Next, what are the impacts of our financing and investments? Do we have a common understanding of what we mean by impact? And how do our indices and funds compare with other similar products, and how do they compare with other relevant reference benchmarks? Finally, are there any emerging opportunities for our business resulting from the increased level of transparency and disclosure? And what are they? How can these be communicated to clients and prospects? And what kind of data points, metrics, and indicators should be used?
Thanks, Tom. That's very helpful. How does ISS ESG's solution help investors to address the issue, become compliant, and report on taxonomy alignment?
So, our EU Taxonomy solution can be used to quantify the share of your investment products and portfolios which are aligned to the relevant objectives set out within the regulatory text. As we know, these will initially be focused upon climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. We achieve this through a rigorous 5-step screening process. 1, identifying relevant economic activities, of which there are 74 in total currently within our solution, and this number is set to increase with the scope of the regulations over time. Secondly, quantification of respective revenues generated from those aligned activities. Next, checking for substantial contribution to one of the taxonomy objectives. Then, ensuring the activity imposes no significant harm upon any of the remaining 5 taxonomy objectives. And finally, checking that minimum social safeguard standards are met, in line with regimes set out by 2 prominent global industry standards bodies, the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises and the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. We currently apply approximately 400 screening factors across a universe of 6,700 issuers covering all major indices, with more in the pipeline. This will be updated once the draft delegated acts are finalised. One challenge being faced by the market is the lack of available data in the market that is currently being disclosed by investee companies. Where there is not enough data available to conclude with absolute certainty whether revenues are taxonomy aligned or not, ISS ESG's solution goes beyond a binary yes-no classification to break down revenues further into likely aligned, potentially aligned, and likely not aligned categories. Revenues are then aggregated by alignment category at an overall issuer level. The additional granularity and segmentation provide vital flexibility to our clients, who can in turn manipulate and interpret the data as they see fit. Clients are then able to integrate this data into existing processes and procedures with other ESG and sustainable finance datasets, supporting engagement activities as well as investment decision-making research.
Thank you, Lydia and Thomas, for taking the time to discuss the EU Taxonomy requirements for market players, as well as the EU Taxonomy solution offered by ISS ESG. To learn more about ISS ESG's EU Taxonomy solution, visit our website at iss-esg.com. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to tune in next time.